Okay. Hey, y'all. Hey. That was like so delayed and slightly low. Let's try that again. Hey, y'all.
Hey.
All right. And hey to folks in internet land. So, we are gathering once again for our Wednesday night Bible study series that has been focused on celebrating dynamics of Black folks and Black Americans and Christian religion. And so, you know, what I've been saying is that we hope that we celebrate Black people all the time at Wedgewood, but why not particularly during Black History Month? So we started our series with my mom. So my students have joked about calling her Reverend Doctor so many times that now I'm like Reverend Doctor. Okay, not Reverend Doctor. Dr. Nancy Fairley, she came and started off our time together, and she talked to us about the impact of enslaved Africans in the New World and how that impacted religion. And I just want to make a note that, this difference between saying a slave and saying an enslaved person. So I encourage us not to say slaves, because slaves sounds as if that is naming all of their reality as if, well, they were slaves, and this is what's, we had slaves, and slaves did this, and that's what slaves were meant to do, as opposed to talking about people being enslaved, which, now I want to step back, that's so much louder, as opposed to people being enslaved, which talks about the fact that that is not a natural way for any person to be, that they were dealing with having so much of themselves being stripped away, and yet they were, or my ancestors were able to be resilient and to carry on different aspects of their traditions and embed them into Christianity. So that's where we started, and that was a great time. And then last week we had Reverend and soon to be Reverend Doctor, because he is in his PhD program, Liddell Benson, and he talked to us about liberation theology, focusing on the work of the late, great James Cone. So with him, we were looking at, now that the Black church has been established in the U.S., what does it mean to look particularly at theology through the lens of Black people and Black people in America? And so he focused a whole lot on one of James Cone's great texts. He had many, but God of the oppressed. And so what does it mean to understand God if your starting point is people who are dealing with oppression, particularly Black folks in this country? So today we are continuing that conversation in the sense that, once the scholarship of the Black church was fairly accepted and folks started to do more work around this, then it became really evident that while Black theology was meant to speak to the varied experiences, not a monolith, but the various experiences of Black folks and Black Christians in the church, there was a voice that was still being very much silenced, and that was the voice of Black women, or the Black woman. And so that's where we're going to start today. So today we're going to be talking a bit about womanist theology, and then we're going to end next week with me again, so please come back again. And we're going to be talking a bit about still womanist theology, but the inclusion of womanist theology through the queer lens. Because the beautiful thing about all these different emerging theological traditions, and I'll say they're emerging in terms of scholarship, right? Like, they're not emerging as if, like, enslaved Africans had a theology before they were enslaved. They had theology while they were enslaved. Black people have always had theologies. So it's not as if the theologies themselves are brand new, but the idea of like studying them and making them forms of scholarship and making them something that people are having discourse about, that's the emerging part. And so with each time that the emergence happens, there's another group that says, hey, yes, so we have talked about Black people, and that's great, but you're focusing on men. There's this whole group of people called Black women, and we have something to say, right? So that happened for a while. And then people were like, yes, we are talking about Black men and Black women, but guess what? Black people are queer too, and we have something to say, right? So then that started that discourse. So I get really excited about that. There's some people who will sometimes get annoyed and just say, well, why do we have to be so specific? Like, can't we just say that God is and that's enough? Well, yes, God is. And technically that is enough. but God is experienced through human people, and God is understood and interpreted and discussed and all the things through human people. And human people have very specific social locations and histories and gender identities and sexual orientations. And so, yes, it is enough to say that God is, and at the same time, no, because who is God for me has a lot to do with my social location. So, with that said, we're going to start our time with a brief little documentary. And the name of that documentary is no, that's not it. Where'd it go? There it is. Okay, so this is called What Manner of Woman, a short documentary film. Do I need to move the screen? Oh, okay. I was like, wait, what happened? All right, y'all ready? Yes. Is that loud enough? For me.
If it wasn't for Black women, not only in the church, but in society at large, we would not have a keen sense of what freedom is.
The women ran the church. They did everything behind the scenes and everything on Sunday morning to get ready for what some might consider showtime. They just weren't in the pulpit on Sunday morning. And if it wasn't for the women, if it weren't for the strength and perseverance of the women, we wouldn't have the church that I knew growing up.
If Sunday all the Black women in the Black church decided to leave, I would basically take a text that says, finally my brethren, farewell. Because Black women have so infused and energized the Black church.
If it wasn't for the women, I wouldn't feel that women have a voice in ministry, and certainly I do.
So womanist theology and Black women are essential to the very lifeblood of what we mean by the Black church, the Black religious experience, the Black community. They stand at the heart of it.
For Black women at the crossroads of the ivory towers of the academy and the stained glass windows of the Black church, the 1980s was a time of self-definition. In 1983, the African-American writer and poet Alice Walker coined the term womanist. The creation of this confessional concept was a significant moment for women who found themselves called to teaching in the learned guilds of religion and to ministry in the church.
You don't start out saying, let's be the ones to create womanism. You find yourself in a particular context where there are no Black women's voices and there's no scholarship by Black women, and that you find yourself invisible, and that you find in fact that your voice is not wanted and not heard.
Black women do have voice, even in an institution that said that we didn't, that we were not in history books, that we didn't have a place in the church. And it was through that engagement over a period of time of meeting other women who were in little silos of institutions or in churches that I learned the importance of voice for all people.
One of Jim Collins' students challenged her professor by pulling his coattail and saying, hey, guess what? You Black liberation theologians, you forgot something. To free African Americans who've been under oppression, with the focus only being on freeing the male, you sort of left out half of God's creation here.
Women all over the world began to challenge me, but it started at home with womanist theology and Black women here at Union. Katie Cannon, Jacqueline Grant, Dolores Williams, Kelly Brown Douglas, Joanne Terrell, all of these people contributed to my constant development of Black liberation theology.
A womanist tradition introduces a critical listening to all things. That's actually challenging, and I think probably strengthening to people who can no longer presume affirmation of everything they say. Women, that's one thing. Black women, that's a whole nother thing.
Taken from the Black Southern expression, you acting womanish. Mamas, nanas, aunties, church mothers, and other mothers confirmed, critiqued, and challenged their girl children to ensure that they not only survived, but thrived in a world often configured to destroy their creativity, intelligence, and womanhood.
The word womanism just caught fire for all of us. It was different from feminist. It was our word. It was what our mothers would call us, meaning that we were sassy, meaning that we were courageous. So womanist comes from the Black kind of Southern folklorist way of talking about you are womanish, meaning that you are fast. It means that you are bold. It means that you break boundaries and you don't mind doing that in order to accomplish what you have to accomplish.
Womanism gave me a language. It gave me a way of naming my own experience in a society that does not privilege Black women's knowledge production process, but rather typifies and culturally represents Black women as less or substandard or subhuman in a variety of ways.
So while the term womanist was introduced to the world in the 1980s, its meaning encompassed the lived experience of generations of Black women in America. Women who, like their biblical foremothers, were legally, socially, and even spiritually relegated to the edges of the church and society. These women, by mother wit, sheer will, and passionate determination, charted their own course, rewriting definitions of what it means to be Black, female, and made in the image of God. Katie Cannon and Dolores Williams, Joan Martin, these were the people that made me excited about being a theologian. They are the figures that gave life to my blood and thought, this is what it means to be a church engaged.
We're the only ones we've been waiting for. It's not going to change unless we change it. It's not going to heal unless we heal it.
In my congregation, which is multiracial and multicultural, I lead my congregation with a womanist sensibility. We're always thinking about how to story the gospel by any means necessary. And in a multiracial, multicultural church, the conversations about race and ethnicity and difference and class take on all kinds of nuances. And I think womanism, I'm thinking especially about Alice Walker's definition about we love all the people. And we understand that our cousins are, pink and beige and chocolate brown like me. That has been so important to me as I think about rehearsing the reign of God here on earth.
And trying to help people understand what hermeneutics means. I'll have people in the classroom stand away from the window, stand back here, and tell me as you look through that window, what do you see? And they will give you what they see from this perspective. Then I'll have another student come up, right up on the window, who can see much more than the one from back here. And their description is so beautiful. Wise fact. 99 times out of 100, nobody will say, I see a window pane. Hermeneutic is, what pane are you looking through? What is framing your perspective? And a female womanist perspective is not an African American male's perspective. It's not a Black liberation theologian. It's female.
So the viewpoint of Black women is essential for full understanding of what's going on in the world, as well as what God's Spirit is trying to stir up amongst the people.
Because women represent more than half of the African American community and more than half of Black people all over the world. So why are you going to X that out? You can't X that out. To X that out is to X out humanity.
When I called my first assistant pastor, it was a woman. And I had one of the leaders of the church, a woman, say to me, well, what are you going to do when you want a real minister? I said, pardon me? Because she didn't see a woman as a real minister. But I found that she was not an anomaly. She was normal.
When women are called to preach, the first thing that we say is, no, not me. We wrestle with our own internalization. But as soon as we're able to push past that, dare go into the church, dare go before the congregation and say, God too has called me to preach. The first line of defense is oftentimes one who looks just like her. Do you not know your rightful place? And of course, the very instinct is for us then to say, oh, women are the greatest opposition. Women aren't the greatest opposition. Patriarchy is.
I never will forget one Sunday I was preaching, and one of my favorite womenist scholars, my sister, who I love so much, I was up preaching, and I made a statement related to Sarah in Scripture, and she texted me immediately and said that you don't want to say that. That is offensive. That is oppressive. And the more I took a step back and looked at it, the more it dawned on me I was a contributor at that moment, through the homiletical moment, to oppressing the dominant majority in the congregation. And as their senior pastor, I don't want to contribute to that oppression. So womanism helps us to reframe our language. Womanism helps us to be more communal.
It was seeing women in a church where the women led the deacon board, where there were women who flooded the pulpit, and not just a male pastor as a figurehead. There on Sundays, that finally helped me to open up to the fact that women are being called, old and young, married and single. Women are being used by God, and I finally accepted what I now know to be a call.
The womanist tradition gave me more of a sense of urgency to lift the black church out of its sexist orientation.
One lady in her 90s, I think she was 96 at that time, said to me outside of the church that day with such glee, "I'm so glad I lived to see this day. I just thought it would never happen in my lifetime." I thank God that womanism gave me the strength to stay the course, that she would live to see that day, and that I would be a part of her experience.
What manner of woman is this? These are women who are bold, who are courageous, who are unapologetic. When I think of what manner of woman this is, I think of the particular, peculiar, prophetic, passionate, prolific women who stand on their principles and articulate the wit and wisdom of black women before we came, and make way for women that will follow us.
You know, as somebody who steps into the church, I come as a mother. I come as
All right. Right, it was so close. All right, well, thank you. So, you guys got to see most of it, and so that was, I thought, a good starting place for us. So, is it going to turn back on now? Or no? Yeah. You will? Okay. Cool. So, anything that stood out to you in watching that little documentary?
The thing that jumped out at me was, this is a new word. I'm not familiar with womanist. This is first for me tonight. Was that it's different from feminist.
Yes.
But I think it's a derivative, maybe a subset of feminism. It's definitely not.
Well, it is related,
right?
But the reason why I wouldn't say derivative, the reason why derivative wouldn't be I wouldn't say derivative, is because part of what happened when feminism came on the scene is that most white women were only looking at least first and second wave feminism. Right. They only looked at sexism and completely negated racism. And so, for example, there's some quotes of like Susan B. Anthony saying some things about, like, she has some quote about she'd rather cut off her arm than let the Negro, the beast that is the Negro, to vote. So the reason why womanism stands on its own is because what womanism said was, and there are some people who are black feminists, and there are people that are womanists, and there's a discussion about, is that the same?
Right.
But I would say what womanists did was different. Was they started at the intersection of race and gender, what we would now say is gender. May I have it? Thank you. Go ahead.
No, this is a new word to me tonight, and that it was a distinct word separate from feminism.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But related in the sense that you're looking at the experience of women, but one just definitely takes into account, it's not just gender, but it's also race. Mm-hmm.
I thought it was also interesting that it was acknowledged by several people in the video that without the black women in the church, in the black church, there would be no black church. Mm-hmm. But it's very rarely stated or put out there. Mm-hmm. But this gentleman, I can't remember his name or what his position was, but he said that it was all women that were doing everything behind the scenes, mm-hmm. and everything except the pulpit.
That wasn't James Cone.
No.
It wasn't Jeremiah Wright.
I thought it was interesting because I could
identify
great names
Cone. In there, by the way.
I could identify Cone from last
week. Yeah, there you go. Mm-hmm. And they made mention of Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon, so mm-hmm. just know that that's her picture there.
That's where I've heard her name. Was you talked about her previously at the Center and Saints Center? Yep. Mm-hmm. 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 Anything else that stood out to people in the watching of the video? And I would say we're not going to finish it right now, but just finish it because it's worth it. And I think we had like 2 minutes. So anything else that stood out to people in looking at that?
What they mentioned about what the women internalize about themselves, I think that is not something of back then. I think it's still something going on today of what we internalize that pushes us to now move into our righteous place and callings, that we become apologetic about our presence.
You said apologetic? Well said. Yeah, they talk. One of the people in there talked about being unapologetic. I will say also, if you want to know more about womanist theology, the more than what you're going to get today, because this is just a little sprinkling, then part of why that video is so good is because it gives you names of like lots of people you can go look up their work. So that's another reason why it's pretty exciting. So
was that on Netflix?
YouTube.
Mm-hmm. You just talking womanist?
Mm-hmm. If you type in womanist theology, that's one of the things that comes up. It's like the fourth one down. Okay. But it's called What Manner of Woman Is This?
Right.
He'll put the link on Facebook.
Cool.
Yep. So, a couple of things that I think really to stand out that I want to make mention of. So the term woman-ish was originally, they say, coined by Alice Walker, right? And there was a couple of parts to the definition of what it means to be woman-ish, right? And that comes from the idea of people in the South, like black folks in the South, being like, girl, you're acting grown. And so there was part of it, there's a little bit of a get back in your place, but there's also an acknowledgement of the fact that young black girls are just bold and bright and powerful and capable and able to survive and negotiate different circumstances and so on and so forth. So with that, so she gave a couple of definitions, and there's 2 that I want to highlight, right? So it says also, womanish means a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually, appreciates and prefers women's culture, women's emotional flexibility, values tears as the natural counterbalance of laughter, and values women's strength. Not a separatist, except periodically for health. I can relate to that. Traditionally, a universalist, as in, mama, why are we brown, pink, and yellow, and our cousins are white, beige, and black? Answer, well, the colored race is just like a flower garden with every colored flower represented. And then another definition is loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves food, and love and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself regardless. So I think it invites kind of an unapologetic claiming of the beauty of what it means to be a black and brown girl, but then also an understanding that we are interconnected to all different walks of life and all different peoples. So I think that's really important. And then, so the first to use the term womanist was Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon in an article that she wrote in 1985. So, But I think one of the things that I think that is really key to talk about, and so we're going to talk about one of the Bible, one of the scriptures that womanist theologians have talked about many times, but it's the idea that you start with the lived experience of black women, right? And so as Christians, even though we're starting with experience, of course, the Bible is going to be an important resource, and also our experiences with God, interpretations of the Bible, so on and so forth. So one of the scriptures that has been used and really well discussed by Reverend Dr. Dolores Williams is the story of Hagar that you see in Genesis, right? So I'm going to read to you just a little portion of this, and we're going to talk about it for a second, okay? So far, so good? For folks who want to know, I am in Genesis 16, starting at the very beginning of Genesis chapter 16, and I'm reading the NIV version because that's what pulled up my phone. I usually do the NRSV, so it says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but he had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "Let the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarah had said, or Sarai, she's not Sarah yet. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, his wife took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with her and she conceived. Now, oftentimes I've heard this sermon preached as if they're so happy for Sarah and Abram, and they preach it from a standpoint of like, well, he really needed an heir, he needed a descendant, and she wasn't able to give him one, so yay, he has Hagar that's just so willing to sleep with him. Now, if you think about this, relating this to the lived experiences of African American women and black women all over the world, but particularly black American women who have ancestors who were enslaved, the story just takes on a whole nother connotation. Then I read it as a story of sexual assault and a story of violence, a story of someone who owns another person's body and says, "I don't have children, so here, go take this human and produce children for me through that person." And it looked the thought that Hagar, being an Egyptian slave, so she was foreign, she was a foreigner, she was enslaved, she was young, and she was a woman, that she had no say-so in this matter, right? And so she becomes impregnated, okay? So then it says, when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Yeah, I would imagine so. Then Sarah said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now she knows she is pregnant. She despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." So then he says, "Well, your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best." So then Sarah mistreated her, and Hagar fled from the home. So again, it goes into this conversation of what does it mean when you have no agency and no ownership of your body. I can't help but think also about what does it mean when you have no ownership and no agency of your sexual reproductive rights, and how timely a discussion that is right now in our current political environment. But yes, I can imagine that she did despise her, and she was ready to leave. And again, traditionally, the ways that I've heard this preached, it's as if Hagar was haughty. And what's wrong with her that she thought it was okay to now treat Sarah, and I know that's not how you pronounce it, but Sarai, Sarai, there you go. And how dare she treat Sarai in this way? She was haughty, and she didn't know her place, and I have heard this preached oftentimes outside of womanist theologians in a way that really disrespects Hagar. Okay, so she flees into the wilderness. Now, a thing that has also come out of womanist theology and womanist theologians is the understanding, and I'm sure you may have heard this, but the idea of a God that can make a way out of no way, right? That is a common theme that comes up in womanist theology. And part of that is rooted in the continuation of this story. So she flees, right? And she flees into the wilderness. And so there's a couple different ways to understand what happens in the wilderness. So the wilderness can be a place where you find refuge because whatever is happening in your context is dangerous. It is threatening to who you are, i.e. thinking about Hagar being sexually assaulted, being impregnated, then being mistreated by the people who own her. So her home situation was not good. So she fled into the wilderness seeking God. Now, that was something that, if you remember, my mom was talking about that they had the Hush Harbor and the Hush services. And so, again, you had the idea of enslaved communities that were fleeing into the wilderness to be able to encounter and find God in ways they were not able to do that in their homes. Make sense so far? Okay. So the angel of the Lord comes to her. But then the angel of the Lord says, go back to your mistress and submit to her. So here is where a womanist theologian offered a really great critique for liberation theologians to think about. Because, again, just by virtue of thinking of the name, liberation theology, the focus is on a God, the God of Exodus, right? The God that when your people are enslaved says, let my people go, gets the people out, parts of the Red Sea. I mean, you know the story. Okay, so that's a God of liberating, a God that is always moving people away from the traumatic situations they are a part of. But that's not always a lived reality, right? And so womanist theology invites us to think about, what about a God that sends you back? What about a God that sustains you in the midst of, sorry, my throat got dry. What about a God that sustains you in the midst of a dry throat? There we go. That sustains you in the midst of a horrible situation. And so that was one powerful interpretation that womanist theology could offer, right? Because the angel of the Lord sends her to go back and to submit. To says, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord said to her, you're pregnant, you'll give birth to a son, you will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery, so on and so forth. So I'll pause. What stands out to you guys so far, working with kind of the womanist interpretation of this text? Anything? I don't want to just talk at you. Nothing? Alright, well, I'll keep going then. Maybe I take a break, ask a question.
What was your question?
What stands out to you so far? What sparks your interest or stands out, or you're like, interesting.
I think for me,
y'all are so funny trying not to make eye contact with me. Go ahead.
I think for me, I was thinking about how the part about returning, for her to return, how it's been used as a way of explaining submission, and trying to say this is what submission looks like. Is that no matter what it is, we must always go back. So I have seen it used for me in places where women have tried to run away from abuse, domestic abuse, and then say, well, look at her, she went back. So.
Right. But that's not the end of the story, right? You can't just look at that piece of just she went back. She went back for a portion, but that's not the end of the story. But yes, it can be what I would consider to be a misuse of the text in that way. Any other thoughts? It's okay if you make eye contact and don't say anything. I won't. You don't have to look away so quickly. They're like, no. Okay, so she goes back, right? So she goes back. So then well, I don't feel like reading the whole thing, but she goes back, but she doesn't stay. So again, that's why I said you can't just look at that part of the story, right? So she leaves again. She cannot stand the kind of treatment. By this point, it's also because Sarah has a son. So at this point, there's a rightful heir, right? So she runs back into the wilderness. And this time when she goes to the wilderness, she is encountering the wilderness in a different kind of way. So remember, the first time she was in the wilderness, it was a place of refuge. This time, the wilderness is actually a place of danger, because she gets to a point where she can't go any further, and she believes that she and her son are dying, and so it's too painful for her. So she, the thing that always stood out to me in that story is how much pain she must have been in. She sets her son down, and she says, like, God, I don't want to see this child die, and she, walks away from him. She can still hear him and see him, but she can't, she doesn't want to watch her child die. And the depth of pain that I hear in that statement. So then the angel of the Lord, or some say the Lord himself, herself, the Lord self, depending how you interpret that, comes to her again, and this time does make, as you can consider, the way out of no way, and creates some water there, and they live. Basically, they're able to live, and the whole community spawns forth from her son in her womb. And so at that point, then, womanist theologians will talk about the idea that yes, God sustains, but God also will liberate, but liberate not just for the sake of one person, but for the sake of the whole community, right? Because if you look at the role that historically black women have had in the community, it's not just about black women supporting themselves, but it's about the ways that black women have been the foundation and rock, supporting so much more of an entire community. That makes sense to folks so far? Y'all look sleepy. Wake up. How does that resonate with you guys so far?
Can't come up with anything.
Okay.
I'm speechless.
You're speechless. Okay. Is that a good thing?
Sometimes it is.
All right. Is it today? Yeah? All right. Cool. Speechless. All right. What about you back there in the back?
What's up?
You got any thoughts?
Yeah. It's very funny because I saw a post that Ezra put up. I think it was Ezra. Maybe Ezra comment. It was on Facebook. That line in Black Panther when Killmonger dies and he's getting, I see you guys, I see you there, that line in Black Panther when he says, basically just let me die with my ancestors because they knew that death was better than bondage. And it's funny because when I looked at it in the movie, I was like, dang. But when I thought about it, it kind of made me think the idea of power in a larger sense of individual power versus power in terms of legacy. So to kill yourself is an act of individual power exercised on your own life, but to sustain and move on is an act of power for future generations. Mm-hmm. And that reminds me of this text because it's like the liberation is not just for you, it's for generations after you, and therefore the work that we would say God was to do after you. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
That's well said. I'm glad I asked. Thank you. I hope people in internet land heard that too. Probably not, but it was good though. Sorry.
You got a couple questions online.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So there's some questions online. How do I? You'll tell me. Okay.
Jack then asked.
Hey, Jack.
Is she following God's call, or when is she when she's in the wilderness?
Mm-hmm. So the question is Hagar following God's call to the wilderness? That's a great question. I would venture to say yes, but I would venture to say yes in the larger sense of her story is about her relationship with herself, her son, and God, and where she finds a sense of refuge and agency. Where she finds a sense of of actual like self that is valued and appreciated. So yes, in that sense, but I think that in the moments in which she ran, I think it was, one could say that she was just running, like that it was a very raw survivalist idea of like, I can't deal with this anymore, I can't stay here, I gotta go. Which to me brings me comfort in the idea that whether or not I'm always thinking through like, oh, I know the call of God has said move in this way, that even if I'm running, which I try not to do at this point in my life, but even if I'm running, that God will find me in the places that I run to as well. So. Hey, Mama B.
Just had a comment that said Hagar had to be submissive because she had control over her body.
So did y'all hear that? Hagar had to be submissive because she had no control over her body. And the ways that she found that control was two very different, that she enacted that control, two very different encounters in the wilderness. So, yes. Y'all are making some interesting faces, which makes me think there's more comments that might be coming up. If not, I have some other things I could say, but I like dialogue.
It just really blows my mind that she went through all that. You know, and in some ways, it's that kind of situation still happens, you know, today. You know,
yes,
all
the
this
Hagars
time
of the
that we
world.
had span of time, and it's still happening today. Sad.
And I think in thinking about the Hagars of the world, one of the questions that I think is important to ask ourselves is, how are we showing up? How might we show up like the Abrahams and the Sarahs of the world? Because the historical narrative praises them. Do you know what I mean? Like the historical narrative looks at, and I'm not saying it shouldn't, I'm not going to go that far, but I'm just saying the historical narrative looks like, yes, like Abraham and Sarah, they were so faithful. It was so wonderful that, you know, she got pregnant at 90. Was she 90? Somebody was 90. But just, I mean, it's so, you know, they look at that story like, oh, it is so wonderful. Look at how God moved for them. And that's where we focus, but we don't often look at the way that God moved with and for Hagar. And so I think it's important, especially in a church like Wedgewood, where we could be more inclined to identify with Hagar, which is good. And also, I think it's always important to ask ourselves, and what of the Sarah and the Abrahams? How are we resonating there as well? So, tangentially related, it makes me think about when I preached a sermon some years ago about the idea that we can't just say, I am Trayvon, but we also have to say, I am. And of course, right now, I can't remember his name. Yes, I am George Zimmerman. Thank you. And that is far more painful to say. Yes, hand in the back.
This triangulation reminds me of Brett Kavanaugh's situation.
Say more, please.
If you look at him and his wife, looked at with the scheme, looked at as very committed people, but basically the treatment of the woman who spoke up is essentially like Hagar. Hey, I have no autonomy. I have no control over my body. And the way that society responded to her, to him, and to the wife, kind of like is that situation where it's just like, this is the Sarah, this is the Abraham, and this is the Hagar. Like, a lot of women made the comments were just like, well, it's alright because he's a really great guy.
Right, as if that covers it.
As if it covers it. It's like, you can't say, alright, well, they were really faithful. Like, your commitment to God cannot supersede your commitment to humanity because you were first called to be kind to humanity. So it's like, you can't say, oh, well, you pray a lot, so it's good, whatever you do.
Right, it's all good, right.
It's all good. Like, no, this is all encompassing. Look at it. So can we really even say, can we even really look at his faithfulness with that kind of lens? Or do we
Well, that's a word. Are we elevating people higher than God intended? I would vote to say yes. And I probably have a long list of people. Another thing I want to offer that I really appreciate about womanist theology. So I have wrestled in my life with definitions and understanding of sin. In part because, as a queer person, I have my first encounters with language of sin was it being lobbed at me and used to, kind of beat me up. And so I was like, I don't really know about that. Things that I really appreciate about womanist theology is they focus on the idea of systemic sin and not just individual sin, which I resonate with a lot more. And so the idea is systemic sin, that's a tongue twister, focuses not just on, here at Wedgewood we've talked about Reverend April, she's excellent and brilliant, talks about the idea of sin is missing the mark, but it's been more individual, right? But when we talk about it systemically, we can look collectively at the ways that we participate in everyday life, in systems and institutions, in relationships that dehumanize. And so the idea of sin being defined as the dehumanization of another person. And so if you're doing things to dehumanize them, then that is participating in sin. And that was something that felt very helpful for me to be able to reclaim the word sin. So I offer that to you as well. It's something that has come from womanist theologies. And particularly they've looked at the way that the black female body has been dehumanized and devalued historically in this country. And so you don't just have to go back to period of enslavement. Like that's one of the most obvious, but there have been countless other and continue to be countless other examples of the ways that black female bodies are dehumanized and devalued, and that is a form of sin. I think that has been a very powerful declaration within my own life and my own journey to have that. So, I'll say one more quick thing, and then we're actually going to be kind of at time. So, Reverend Dr. Dolores Williams talks about kind of the 4 elements of womanist theology. And so one of them is multi-dialogical intent. I love all these fancy big words, y'all. Multi-dialogical intent. Basically, it means they value conversations with people from various religious, political, and social communities. So the conversation is inherently with people that are different from varied backgrounds, with the focus as the slow genocide of black people. Then another element is liturgical intent. That just means that it's relevant to the actions, the thought, the worship, the life of the black church. And so it invites the black church, and I would say all churches, but particularly the black church, to examine the messages that they offer that are sexist, that are classist, that are racist, that are colorist, that are homophobic, so on and so forth. Everybody know what colorist means? Is that a term that people are familiar with? No? Okay. So the idea of colorism, particularly now colorism is something that is legitimately worldwide for various reasons. But within black American context, the idea of colorist has to do with a color caste system that was created, that has its roots within the time of enslavement, with the idea that the lighter complexion and the closer you look to white, the better, basically. So it put the idea, if you were fair-skinned, if you had a hair texture that was looser in curl, if you had a phenotype that was more angular, is usually the way that we talk about it, and less Bantu being rounded, that gave you, the assumption in society was that you were smarter, you were cleaner, you were holier, you were better, and then that put the idea that the darker you were, the more Bantu or darker your complexion, the more rounded your features, the kinkier your hair, that puts you on the bottom. And so that became an internalized phenomenon. Anytime you have people that sit under oppression, they internalize it. Like it doesn't matter if it's women internalizing sexism, black people internalizing racism, poor people internalizing classism. You can't help but internalize it. Yes?
It makes me think of an expression that I learned from BET.
Oh boy. I'm
so
nervous.
I'm so nervous. It's very, very educational for us.
Oh, I bet.
Honkies.
Oh, Jesus. What's the term? Oh,
Lord. The brown paper
bag text. Oh, yes. Okay. Woo. That wasn't too bad. I was like, what did BET teach you? Jesus? Yeah, there was a time when there literally people would have to pass the test. Are you lighter or darker than a brown paper bag? Yeah. So, that's colorism. Okay, so then another element is didactic intent, which means that it considers teaching, the importance of teaching, and teaching how the black church deals with the moral life through being concerned with justice, quality of life, and survival. So I like that. Not just justice, but justice, quality of life, and survival. And the last one is a commitment to using female imagery and metaphorical language, right? And so not just using, I mean, that's pretty straightforward, but not just using language and metaphors that are traditionally thought of as male, but also making sure that you think about it in female language. And it's funny because like there's things that we will say that we don't often think, like even if we're not saying he, we still will often use language that is associated with the masculine when we're talking about God. So it's not just about saying like he or she, but it's also thinking about imagery and metaphor and language, right? So like if you talk about like the womb of God, or what is it, like the idea of being loved by God is like being in the womb. Like that's a very female centered imagery. Now there are dynamics you can get into in terms of trans feminine identity, but for now, that was just the first example that popped into my head. So, all right, well, that was it. That was our kind of quick dive into womanist theology. Any last thoughts or questions out in the interwebs? Anything? No? Okay. Well, thank you, Jack. Thank you, Mama B, for watching and for asking a question. Anybody out here got any thoughts or questions? Yes.
So how did this woman theology help you personally in your calling or enter your calling?
How did it help me enter my calling? Well.
Oh, did it? Or not?
It did. So Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon was doing a semester at Davidson. She's actually from Concord. Her brother is the pastor of a local church here. So my mom and she and my mom got to know each other, got to be friends. And it's around the time that I was wrestling with going to seminary. And, God was like, you're going to seminary? And I was like, no. And God was like, no, really. And I was like, you're funny. And so my mom was like, well, why don't you sit down with, would you like to meet Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon? And, I'm like, yes. I don't geek out about much. But when it comes to like black intellectuals, I just, yeah. So we went to lunch and I was talking to her about wrestling with my call. And for me, honestly, it wasn't about me being a woman. It was about me being queer. I didn't want to fight people about it. But she very much affirmed the call. And I was feeling like, I'm kind of young. I don't really know if I want to do this. She compared me to Jeremiah, which I was like, okay. And as you can see, I went to seminary. So it was very helpful, very helpful. And also realizing that even if the understanding of queer identity kind of was controversial, that it was because a founding mother was understanding and moving in that direction, that I was like, oh, I can do this. So it was helpful. All right. Well, thank you so much, good people of God.